A certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. That's actually getting ready to happen on the other side of that. We looked at that story in our Love Languages series. Mary's brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus. Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, Jesus stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Jesus doesn't come right away. And remember, again, this seems like an obvious thing to say, but it's worth pointing out. This story takes place 2,000 years ago. It does not take place today. So when we say they sent word to Jesus to tell him that Lazarus was sick, Jesus didn't have one of these, right? They can't just call him or text him or email him. As far as I know, they can't carrier pigeon him. Like there's a whole timetable here that we, in all of our tech and advancements culturally and all that stuff, I don't even know how to put the right number on it. How many days did it take for Lazarus to get sick, for Mary and Martha to be concerned? If there was a physician around, again, there's no like EKGs or brain scans or any of those things. There's some period of time that takes place here where he's sick and then he's not getting better and then they're worried that he's going to die. And then Mary and Martha think to themselves, we need Jesus. And we got to get word to him, and that's going to take some time. And word gets to Jesus. And then when Jesus says this bit about this illness will not lead to death, again, remember, no like he's not telling them that on the phone. He's not saying that to them at all because they're not there for him to say it to them. Jesus says that bit, we think, to his disciples, his followers, those who are around. This illness will not lead to death. But that's not information he can communicate unless he uses his Jesus powers and does it, telepathically or something like that. He can't tell Mary and Martha that right at that moment. And he doesn't tell them that right at that moment. They say, Lord, he's sick. We need your help. Jesus, not to them, but to his followers, says, this isn't going to lead to death. And then accordingly, Jesus doesn't come right away. Jesus doesn't drop what he's doing, leave the people that he's with, overly adapt his timetable, his schedule, his plan, any of that. He stays where he is for a minute. They need his help, but he doesn't come right away. And just like you and me, Mary and Martha are not working with all of the information because they're not God. They're not Jesus. They just know that their brother is sick and they need help. But he doesn't come right away. And so in verse 17, we find what has already taken place. Jesus eventually arrives, and when he does, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. So, Lazarus dies. And the story tells us that when Jesus gets there, Lazarus, in fact, has been dead for 4 days. Now, again, 2,000 years ago, no brain scans, no EKGs. How do you know when someone has died? Back then, there's a longer period of time where, we're making sure that people are dead. There are documented historical accounts of people getting ready to be put in tombs, and then they realize, whoops, that guy's not really dead yet. And as we know, when we speak of movies that we've seen over and over and over again, if you've seen The Princess Bride, you know that there's a difference between mostly dead and all dead, right? Because mostly dead is slightly alive. but Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. This also answers some, like sometimes when people say, how come Jesus had to be in the tomb for a certain amount of days? If Jesus dies and then is risen immediately, we needed to know he was dead. And Lazarus is dead and has been dead for 4 days. People have come from the neighboring towns to offer their sympathy to Mary and Martha and all of that stuff. The text wants you to know that Lazarus is dead. So, Jesus arrives on the scene 4 days after he has been in the tomb. Martha goes out to meet him when he comes in. Mary stays home. And I think there's just there's a good kind of practical tip here that, I don't even know if it's a tip, just a practical thought. When it comes to grief, when it comes to loss, when it comes to walking through things that are hard and difficult, we don't all do it the same. If you've walked through something hard, if you walk through loss and grief, you know that for some people, things like a visitation and a receiving line, for some people that is life-giving, and for some of us, that is life-taking. Amen, yeah? We're not all the same. And we grieve differently. We've shared before when we walked through the love language series that sometimes the best way to figure out what your love language is to consider what you do when someone you love loses someone they love. Because some of us are going to drop everything and be there. Some of us are going to pick up the phone and call right away. Some of us are going to call the florist first instead. Some of us are going to walk to the kitchen and put on the apron and start making a meal. And some of us just need to give them a hug because we don't know what else to do, but that we can do, and we can do it well. We're not all the same. And if you find a visitation line at a funeral really life-giving, you're not by default like a better Christian than someone who doesn't. We grieve and respond differently, and if we could pick how we felt in those moments, we'd pick to feel a lot better, right? We walk through it differently, and sometimes something we can do is give ourselves some grace for saying, we're doing this the best that we can. Martha goes out to meet Jesus. Mary stays home. They're both walking through the same thing. They both loved their brother. They both loved and love Jesus. And as we'll see, they both have some thoughts about how this story could have gone differently. That's why they reached out to him in the first place. The sentence I found myself saying the most in the pandemic is, it's all right to call a heavy thing heavy. And I have just kind of found myself continuing to use that phrase a lot. It's all right to call a heavy thing heavy. This is Father's Day, as you know. This is also my daughter's 3rd birthday. She was born in June of 2020 in Blacksburg, Virginia, little baby Hokie. And June of 20, I got one in Knoxville and one in Blacksburg, so we were balanced out in the Holston Conference. In June of 2020, it was a scary time to have a baby. Nobody else could go to the hospital except me. Of course, Alex was there. It'd been weird if I went without her. And it was just weird, especially because that was our second kid, so we'd known the rhythms with Covington, and then when Sophia was born, it was just us, nurses and us, and that was it. And some of you I know who've had kids in that similar season of life, it was weird and strange, and it's all right to call a heavy thing heavy. Sometimes we dudes and we fathers are bad at calling heavy things heavy. We like to carry all the groceries in one trip, baby. We're bad at saying the thing that, the best thing to say when something is heavy. You don't even have to say it's heavy. You know what the best thing to say when something is heavy is? Give me a hand with this. Give me a hand with this. It's all right to call a heavy thing heavy. And we might experience that differently, but the smartest, best, clearest thing to say when something is heavy is can you give me a hand with this? Sometimes the most heroic details in the story are not the Jesus bit at the end where he raises the dead, but along the way for us. Because I don't know how to raise the dead. Literally, I don't know how to do it. But I know how to try to help somebody. And I'm trying to get better at saying, hey, can you give me a hand with this? And sometimes offering that hand or speaking it aloud, sometimes that is the most heroic thing we can do. Martha in verse 21, out on the road with Jesus. Here's how you can tell that they're close. She doesn't pull any punches with Jesus, right? Look at this sentence. I'm going to read it in a second, but you just look at it, okay? She loves him. They are close. She reached out to him for a reason. He didn't come right away. She went through all that effort and carrier pigeons and all that stuff, but he didn't come right away. And she sees him on the road. Mary stays home. She sees him on the road, and the first thing she says to him is, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to Martha, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, look, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. That's one of the first, in our Methodist liturgy, that's one of the first things we say at a funeral. I'm the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will never die. Those who believe in me will never die. Do you believe this? And Martha said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. I really like Rob Bell. I use him a lot, an author and a pastor that was really influential for me about 20 years ago, has a great teaching on this where he just talks about, look, sometimes that's enough. When we're carrying heavy things, when we're walking through loss and grief, and when we think to ourselves, Jesus, where were you? If you had been here, this would have gone differently. If you had been here and I needed you here and I asked for you to be here, I prayed and all of that stuff, and you didn't seem to be here, and then the bad thing happened or the hard thing happened. Lord, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus says, your brother will rise again. And she says, look, yes, I get it. I know he'll rise again at the last day like all of us. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? Sometimes when we're carrying heavy things, when it comes to our faith, sometimes it is enough for us to just be able to say, yeah, I still believe this. And that's it. Because especially in these heavy moments, we don't have all the answers. We have way more questions. And if we're honest, we have and can carry a bit of, if you had been here, God, where were you? This would have gone differently, and I asked for it to go differently, and it didn't. And we can say theologically that God really is with us and was with us in all those things, but it can feel sometimes like that's not the case. And Martha communicates that directly to Jesus. I think that's how I think. This is when I'm going to step away from the podium. I think the way you can tell that Martha and Jesus are really close is not because she doesn't say that to him, but because she does. The way you can tell that they're close is not because Martha doesn't say to herself, well, there must be a reason, and who am I to question you? And I am going to pretend like I'm totally fine with this. I'm going to pretend like I'm totally fine with this to God, who, by the way, knows anyway. she says the thing to him. Lord, if you had been here, this wouldn't have happened. I think that's how you can tell the depth of their relationship. I think God is big enough for our feelings. I think God is big enough for our questions. And I think God is big enough for the times when we say, hey, this is heavy and I need some help and I wish you had helped differently or faster or sooner. And I don't know what to do with any of that. I think God is big enough for all of that. I hope he is. I think that's how you can tell the depth of their relationship. Not pretending, here's the token answers that I'm supposed to say, but here's the real, this is how I feel, and I'm going to say it to you, God, because you know anyway. And then Jesus tells her, do you still believe this? This being the good news. Not this being there's a reason and a purpose why this happened and all that stuff and life is a mystery and all that, but just the good news is I am the resurrection and the life. Do you still believe it? Sometimes it is enough for us to be able to say, just for today, in the midst of carrying all these groceries at once, in the midst of carrying these heavy things, I still believe this. Sometimes for us, that is enough for this day. When Jesus interacts with Mary on down in verse 32, it's going to be the same dynamic, the same question. This is verse 32. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, Jesus was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Jesus said, where have you laid him? And they said, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. Mary asks the same question, same depth of relationship, expressed differently. Martha meets him on the road, Mary stays home. Same question, Lord, if you had been here. And Jesus is deeply moved, and this is the New Revised Standard Version up there on the screen does a more elongated and maybe honorable version of it. This Bible verse is Jesus wept, right? It's the shortest verse in all of Scripture. But consider the depth that takes place in that moment. Because what's so tempting with this story, at least for me, is it's so tempting to just assume that, consider what Jesus could have done. Jesus could have showed up on the outskirts of town. Jesus could have showed up and looked Martha in the face and said, wait right here. I'm going over there to get him. Right? Because that's the story. He's going to do the thing. He is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He is there to do the thing. But he doesn't show up and say it to him. He could do that. He could show, and it just seems so much easier and so much simpler for him to just show up and say, sorry, I'm late. I'm going to go raise him from the dead. Hang on one second. Because he's gonna do it. And we all know that. And yet, in the midst of all of that, Jesus, preparing to do the miracle itself, does not stop him from being with them fully in their loss. It does not stop him from being with them fully in their grief and their pain. He weeps with them. He does not say, why are you crying? Just hang on. He doesn't do any of that. He's with them. And his, not just capacity, but the fact that he's going to do the miracle doesn't stop him an inch from being with them in their grief, and their pain, and their loss. Jesus could show up and say to Mary and Martha the same thing he says to the disciples all the way back at the beginning of the story, which is, this is happening for a reason and a purpose. This is for my glory. All of this is for this reason, and it's beyond you. You have little faith. He could say any of those things. And instead, he's with them. He cries with them. He weeps with them. And I find such comfort in the fact that, Jesus is going to make it all okay. He is. Jesus is going to make it all okay, but that doesn't stop him 1 inch from being fully with them in their pain. Because, like we believe, or we're called to believe that Christ has died and Christ has risen and Christ will come again. That there is coming a day when all of the heaviness that we carry, that we don't know how to carry or even how to ask for help with, all of that, there is coming a day when we can just let that go. When all the tears are wiped away and all the knees will bow and all of that. We believe in that. Some days that's enough just for us to believe. And Jesus, knowing that, Jesus could come to us and say, look, it's all going to be fine. Stop whining. Stop complaining. It's going to be fine. Yeah, this life will be hard, but it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it so much. He's done the thing. And it is finished, and we all have this hope of resurrection and redemption and renewal in the life of the world to come. And none of that stops him an inch, a millimeter from being with us in our stuff, in our heaviness, in our pain, in our questions, in our all of that. He is with us. And all that other stuff is still true. Sometimes the most heroic thing we can do, I can't raise the dead. And I'm pretty sure you can't either. So if we can't do that, sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is just be with people. Because I have also been at funerals, and I bet you have too, when well-intentioned Christians have offered the reasons and the mystery and the all of that. And sometimes that just makes it heavier. Sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is just be with people in their heaviness. Sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is say, can you give me a hand with this? And sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is say, yeah, I can. And just be with them. Can't do the story without the end, right? Here's the end, verse 38. Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, ever practical, sister of the dead man, said, we looked at this a few weeks ago too, Lord, he stinketh, right? There's a stench. He's all dead. He's been dead for 4 days. Jesus said to her, didn't I tell you if you believed, you'd see the glory of God? They took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he said this, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come on down. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let that man go. That's the end, and thanks be to God for that. And chances are every single one of you knew that's how it ends, yeah? And again, we know how this whole thing ends. And thanks be to God for that. But along the way, don't miss that this Jesus, even knowing how it ends, even having already done it, even having all of that stuff, it doesn't stop him an inch from being with us in our stuff. And he knows the reasons, and we don't get to know all of that. And he has the power, and sometimes we get to see it up close in the moments that we pray for, and sometimes we don't. We don't always get access to the power or especially the wisdom. But what we do get with this God is presence. Because no matter what it is, our God is with us in it. Sometimes the most heroic thing we can do, if I can't raise the dead, sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is say, hey, can you give me a hand with this? And sometimes the most heroic thing we can do is say, yeah, I can. Because Christ has died and Christ has risen and Christ will come again. And ultimately, ultimately, everything's going to be okay. But today, our God is still with us, fully, weeps with those who weep, helps carry those who are carrying heavy things, and calls us, I think, not to offer answers and reasons and mysteries and all of that, but just sometimes to offer a hand to those who need help. And when we are the ones who need help, to be brave enough to ask.